Chapter 1. Fleeting Encounters. The city hummed with the distant murmurs of life. Beneath the canopy of swaying trees and amidst the bustling crowd, there she was, an ordinary girl with a life slowly unraveling, yet her presence seemed anything but ordinary. Emily moved through the streets with a quiet grace, her pale features softened by a weariness that could not be hidden. The shadows beneath her eyes, the fragile curve of her lips, there was something in her that spoke of stories untold, battles fought in silence, and moments that slipped away like sand through fingers. George noticed her long before he ever realized what she would come to mean. He was one among many, leading a life of casual indifference, with eyes that skimmed over people rather than seeing them. He'd been that way for as long as he could remember. Confident, brash, someone who lived on the surface of things, never caring to dig too deep. To him, life was simple. Win, move forward, and avoid anything that threatened to slow him down. Yet, as he crossed paths with her that day, something shifted. There was no grand revelation, no instant spark that movies often spoke of. It was merely a glance, a fleeting, momentary connection in a sea of disconnected faces. She was sitting on a weathered bench in the park, the sunlight filtering through leaves above, casting dappled patterns across her thin frame. Her eyes, deep and dark, stared at nothing in particular, lost in a world far removed from the noise around her. It was as if she were somewhere else, somewhere quieter, where thoughts wandered freely and pain whispered its truths. For reasons unknown even to himself, George's gaze lingered. It wasn't attraction, at least, not in the conventional sense. It was curiosity, perhaps mixed with a touch of confusion. There was something in her that disrupted his usually clear-cut world, a stillness that he didn't understand. He stood there for longer than he intended, watching her as she absent-mindedly traced patterns on the bench's worn wood with delicate fingers. Time seemed to stretch, turning minutes into something slower, more deliberate. It was a look, just a brief one, but it was enough. She glanced up, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second. They were tired eyes, weary but soft, holding within them a depth that spoke of burdens carried alone. George quickly looked away, embarrassed by the thought that she might have noticed his stare. Yet even after he turned and walked away, her image lingered in the back of his mind like a forgotten melody that refused to be silenced. The days passed, and life resumed its usual rhythm, but that brief encounter clung to him. He found himself back in that park more than once, his feet drawn to the same paths, as if hoping to catch another glimpse of her. He couldn't explain it to himself, this sudden obsession with someone he didn't know. But each time he walked through the park and didn't see her, a strange sense of disappointment settled within him. He began to imagine what her life might be like, what might have led to the sadness that clung to her like an invisible shroud. There was a fragility in her that was haunting, as though life had chipped away at her piece by piece, leaving behind a mosaic of broken dreams and half-formed hopes. Weeks passed before he saw her again. This time, she was in the same spot, but with an air of fragility that seemed even more pronounced. Her face was paler, her eyes ringed with shadows, but her expression held a quiet determination that belied her frail appearance. She was holding a small notebook, the pages fluttering lightly in the breeze as she stared at the lines before her. Her lips moved, but no words escaped. It was as if she was having a conversation with the wind, sharing secrets that no one else could hear. George watched from a distance, unsure of why he felt the urge to approach, but too conflicted to act on it. What could he, someone who had always brushed off vulnerability as weakness, possibly say to someone like her? And yet, the thought of turning away, of walking back to his routine life, filled him with a quiet sense of loss. So he stayed, merely observing, wondering if she noticed his presence at all. There was something unsettling about the way her presence began to affect him. He felt a strange protectiveness toward her, a desire to somehow shield her from the invisible battles she was clearly fighting. But what could he, with all his bravado and bluster, do? He was a stranger to her, just another face in the crowd. Yet, for reasons that defied logic, she mattered. He stayed until the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the park. She eventually stood, closed her notebook, and walked away, her steps slow and deliberate. George followed her with his eyes until she was out of sight, feeling the weight of something unfamiliar settle in his chest, a longing that went beyond attraction or curiosity. It was the beginning of something he couldn't name, a change in him that was as unsettling as it was inevitable. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her face floated into his mind. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, yet he felt an unshakable pull towards her. In that fleeting encounter, she had left an imprint on him, one that would only grow deeper with time. As sleep finally took him, George knew that something within him had shifted, setting the stage for a journey he never expected to take. A journey that would strip away the layers of the man he thought he was and reveal someone entirely different, someone capable of feeling more deeply than he ever thought possible. In the silence of that first encounter, a story had begun to write itself, a story of love born in the shadow of suffering, a love that would leave him forever changed, even if he didn't yet understand how. The chapter ended not with resolution, but with uncertainty, a fitting prelude to what was yet to come. Chapter 2. The Fragility of Hope. Time has a way of slipping by unnoticed, especially when one is trapped in the monotony of daily routines. Yet, amidst the repetitive cycle of his days, George found his thoughts repeatedly drifting to the quiet girl from the park. It was a subtle distraction at first, but as the days passed, she became a constant presence in his mind. Her image lingered like a persistent echo, one he couldn't shake, even as he tried to return to the life he knew. George's world was uncomplicated, built on bravado and fueled by a desire to maintain a carefully crafted image. He was known for his charm, his confident swagger, and the easy way he navigated through life's challenges. He prided himself on never getting too attached, on living in the moment without letting anything weigh him down. But somehow, without even realizing it, the thought of her began to chip away at that carefree exterior. He returned to the park more often, always hoping to see her again. It became a routine, one he both resented and eagerly anticipated. Each time he entered the park, he felt a pang of nervous anticipation, wondering if she would be there, seated in that same spot on the weathered bench. The days when he didn't see her left him restless, frustrated by his own inexplicable longing. But the days when she was there, those were the moments that left him unsettled in a different way. It wasn't just her presence that intrigued him. It was the stillness she carried with her. There was a quiet strength in her solitude, a resilience in the way she seemed to face the world with calm acceptance. George often found himself wondering what kind of life she led, what battles she might be fighting that left such a mark on her delicate frame. He had seen enough of life to recognize that her sadness ran deep, buried beneath layers of resolve and determination. Yet, there was a light within her, a flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished, even in the face of whatever darkness she was grappling with. Weeks passed, and George's visits to the park became more frequent. He watched her from a distance, careful not to intrude but unable to look away. He noticed the small details, the way her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages of her notebook, the way she occasionally closed her eyes as if to shut out the world for just a moment. He saw the way she clutched her coat tighter around herself on the colder days, as if bracing against more than just the chill in the air. Each observation deepened the sense of connection he felt, even though they remained strangers in every sense of the word. One afternoon, he arrived at the park earlier than usual. The air was crisp with the first hints of autumn, leaves beginning to fall in slow spirals to the ground. The bench where she usually sat was empty, and George felt an inexplicable sense of disappointment. He paced for a while, hoping she would appear, but as the hours ticked by, the emptiness of the bench seemed to mirror the growing void in his chest. He didn't know what to make of it, this strange attachment he had developed. It made no sense, yet it felt as natural as breathing. Just as he was about to leave, he caught sight of her walking slowly down the path. She moved with more difficulty than before, each step measured and deliberate. George's breath caught in his throat as he noticed the changes in her. She seemed thinner, paler, her skin almost translucent in the fading light. She looked fragile, as if a strong gust of wind could knock her over, yet there was still that quiet determination in her eyes. She walked to the bench and sat down heavily, her shoulders slumping as if the simple act of sitting required effort. She pulled out her notebook again, but this time, she stared at the blank pages for what seemed like an eternity. Her fingers traced the lines on the paper, but she didn't write. Her expression was one of deep contemplation, as though she was searching for the right words, or perhaps the strength to face whatever thoughts were swirling in her mind. George watched her closely, feeling an ache in his chest that he couldn't explain. There was a sadness in her stillness, a resignation that hadn't been there before. As the afternoon faded into dusk, the park emptied out, leaving only the two of them in the gathering shadows. George stood frozen in place, torn between the desire to reach out and the fear of intruding on her solitude. He knew he was a stranger, someone who had no right to interfere in her life. But the more he watched her, the more he felt a pull to do something, anything, to ease the burden she was carrying. Yet, he remained rooted to the spot, unable to take that step. Eventually, she closed the notebook and tucked it away, her movements slow and deliberate. She rose from the bench, wincing slightly as if in pain, and wrapped her coat tightly around her frail body. George's heart pounded as she turned to leave, her steps faltering as she walked down the path. He clenched his fists, willing himself to do something, but all he could do was watch her retreating figure disappear into the twilight. That night, George couldn't sleep. The image of her haunted him, the frail girl with a spirit stronger than her body could bear. He found himself staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled in a web of conflicting emotions. He wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but he didn't know how. He didn't even know her name. Yet, she had become more than just a passing thought. She was a presence that lingered in his mind, a quiet reminder that some things in life were beyond his control. In the darkness of his room, George realized that he was no longer the same man he had been. Something had shifted inside him, something that went deeper than curiosity or fascination. He felt a need to be there for her, to be a part of her world, even if it was only as a silent observer. The realization both frightened and thrilled him. He had never felt this way about anyone before. This overwhelming urge to protect, to care, to be more than just a bystander in someone else's story. As the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, George made a decision. He didn't know what lay ahead, didn't know if he would ever have the courage to approach her. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't ignore the pull he felt any longer. Whether it was fate, chance, or something else entirely, he was drawn to her in a way that defied reason. And for the first time in his life, he was willing to follow that instinct, no matter where it led. The fragility of hope hung in the air, delicate, elusive, yet powerful enough to change everything. Chapter 3: Beneath the Surface. The days grew shorter as autumn settled in, and with it, the park took on a new kind of beauty. The trees shed their leaves in vibrant hues of red, orange, and gold, carpeting the ground in a soft, colorful blanket. The chill in the air became sharper, but for George, The changing season only deepened the strange bond he felt with the girl who had come to occupy his thoughts. Despite their silence, despite the distance that still existed between them, he found himself coming to the park every day, hoping to catch sight of her. It wasn't long before she became a fixture in his routine. She was always there in the late afternoons, seated on the same bench with her notebook resting on her lap. The world seemed to fade away when she was there, leaving only the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the city as background noise. George kept his distance, content just to watch her from afar. He observed her with a careful eye, noticing the subtle changes that time had etched onto her face, the deepening shadows beneath her eyes, the way she moved with a growing weariness, as though each step required more effort than the last. There were moments when she appeared lost in thought, staring at the pages of her notebook without writing a single word. Other times, she scribbled furiously, her pen scratching against the paper in hurried strokes. George couldn't help but wonder what stories or thoughts she was capturing, what emotions she was pouring onto those pages. He imagined a world within those lines, a world filled with hopes, fears, and dreams that were hers alone. As the days passed, George's curiosity evolved into something deeper. He was no longer just intrigued by her. He was invested in her well-being. He began to notice the subtle signs of her struggle, the way she would wince when she thought no one was watching, the tightness in her expression when she was lost in thought, and the fleeting moments when her eyes filled with a sadness so profound that it seemed to swallow her whole. Yet even with the weight of her silent burden, there was still a quiet resilience in her. George saw it in the way she returned to the park each day, despite whatever challenges she faced. He saw it in the way she never let the weariness overpower her entirely, in the way she found solace in the small routines she maintained. It was as if she was clinging to the simple pleasures, the crisp air, the rustling leaves, the golden light of the setting sun, as a way to anchor herself in a world that was slipping away from her. George found himself coming closer, little by little. He still didn't approach her directly, but he allowed himself to sit on a nearby bench, within sight but not too close. He was careful not to intrude, yet he couldn't deny the pull that drew him nearer. He would sit there for hours, pretending to read a book or simply gazing at the scene around him, but his attention was always on her. He noticed how she would occasionally glance up from her notebook, her eyes scanning the park as if searching for something, or perhaps someone. Each time she did, George held his breath, wondering if she would finally notice him. But she never seemed to see him, not really. Her gaze would sweep across the park and then return to the notebook, her thoughts hidden behind a veil of solitude. George began to wonder if she even wanted to be seen, or if her isolation was a protective shield she had built around herself. He imagined what might have caused such a shield to form, what pain or loss might have driven her to seek refuge in her own world. It was a question that gnawed at him, filling him with a longing to break through that barrier, to be the one who could offer her some measure of comfort. One chilly afternoon, George noticed a new detail, a small medical bracelet around her wrist, barely visible beneath the cuff of her coat. It was a stark reminder of the battles she was fighting, battles that were hidden beneath her calm exterior. The sight of that bracelet sent a jolt of realization through him, a reminder that time was not on her side. The knowledge settled like a stone in his chest, making his concern for her even more urgent. He felt helpless in the face of it all, torn between the desire to help and the fear of overstepping a boundary that might be there for a reason. The park became a place of quiet reflection for him. He spent hours sitting there, not just watching her but thinking about his own life. In the silence of those afternoons, George found himself questioning everything he had once held dear. The bravado, the carefree attitude, the shallow pursuits that had once defined him. All of it seemed trivial now. It was as if the girl he barely knew had held up a mirror to his soul, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had long ignored. Beneath the surface, there was a yearning for something more, something deeper than the fleeting pleasures he had always chased. As the days wore on, George noticed that she was becoming weaker. Her steps grew slower, and there were moments when she would pause in the middle of the path, as if gathering her strength to keep moving. She still maintained her routine, but there was a heaviness in her movements that hadn't been there before. The sight of her struggling tore at him, filling him with a sense of urgency that he couldn't quite place. He wanted to do something, anything, to ease her burden, but he remained rooted in place, unable to bridge the gap between them. The first frost arrived, dusting the park with a thin layer of ice. The trees stood bare and skeletal, their branches reaching toward the pale gray sky. Despite the cold, George continued to visit the park, knowing that she would be there, as determined as ever to cling to her routines. He couldn't understand why she insisted on coming, especially when it was clear that her body was growing frilier with each passing day. But he admired her determination, even as it worried him. One afternoon, when the sky was thick with the promise of snow, George saw her falter. She had just risen from the bench, her notebook clutched to her chest, when her legs buckled beneath her. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, she stumbled, her face contorted in pain. George was on his feet in an instant, instinctively moving toward her. But before he could reach her, she steadied herself, leaning heavily on the back of the bench. She stood there for a long time, her breath visible in the cold air, her hands trembling as she clung to the bench for support. George stopped in his tracks, torn between the impulse to help and the fear of intruding. He watched her with bated breath, his heart pounding in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, she took a deep breath and began to walk, her steps slow and unsteady but determined. George's fists clenched at his sides, frustration and helplessness warring within him. He hated seeing her like this, so vulnerable, so alone. But he knew that this was her battle to fight, and all he could do was bear witness to it. As she disappeared down the path, George remained standing there, the cold biting into his skin. He had always prided himself on being in control, on never letting anything get under his skin. But this girl, this fragile, determined girl, had unraveled something inside him. She had shown him a kind of strength that didn't rely on bravado or confidence, but on quiet resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a strength he had never understood before, but now it was all he could think about. Beneath the surface of his growing concern, something else was taking root, something more profound than mere curiosity or sympathy. It was the stirrings of a connection he didn't fully comprehend, a connection that ran deeper than words or actions. It was as if, in her silent struggle, she had opened a door within him, a door that led to emotions he had never allowed himself to feel. And now that it was open, he couldn't shut it again. The snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering the park in a blanket of white. George stood there for a long time, lost in thought, as the world around him transformed. He knew that he couldn't remain a passive observer much longer. He knew that something had to change, that he had to find a way to reach out before it was too late. But for now, all he could do was wait, watch, and hope that the girl with the notebook would continue to return, day after day, so he could be there, if only to witness her quiet courage from afar. Beneath the surface of their unspoken connection, a story was unfolding, one that neither of them fully understood yet. But it was a story that would change both of their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The fragility of hope lingered in the air, delicate and elusive, yet powerful enough to push George toward a path he never thought he would take. Chapter 4. The Distance Between Us. Winter arrived in full force, blanketing the city in icy winds and heavy snowfalls. The once vibrant park now lay in silence, its paths buried under layers of snow, the trees stripped bare and frozen in time. The world outside had grown harsh and unforgiving, but George's visits to the park remained constant. Even as the cold bit into his skin and the snow crunched beneath his boots, he found himself drawn there, day after day. He could no longer deny that he was waiting for her. The girl who had become more than just a passing curiosity now held a place in his thoughts that grew with each passing day. He watched for her arrival with a mix of anticipation and dread. Her presence had become a strange source of comfort to him, but he couldn't shake the gnawing worry that each day might be the last time he would see her. Despite the worsening weather, she still came, as determined as ever. Wrapped in a thick coat, her scarf pulled tightly around her neck, she moved through the snow with slow, deliberate steps. Her face was paler than before, her eyes sunken, dark circles framing her once bright gaze. George noticed the way her body seemed to shrink into itself, as if the weight she carried was finally taking its toll. Yet, there was a stubbornness in her that refused to give in. Even on the coldest days, she would sit on her usual bench, her notebook resting on her lap as she stared out at the frozen landscape. George's own emotions were in turmoil. He had never felt this way about anyone before. This overwhelming need to protect someone he barely knew. It was an unfamiliar sensation, unsettling in its intensity. He could no longer pretend that this was just curiosity or concern. It was something deeper, something that had grown roots in his heart without him even realizing it. But with that feeling came frustration, a frustration born from his inability to reach out, to cross the invisible distance that kept them apart. He struggled with his thoughts, torn between wanting to approach her and the fear of breaking whatever fragile connection existed between them. She was a mystery he desperately wanted to unravel, but he knew that her silence was deliberate, that her solitude was not something to be carelessly disturbed. And yet, every day, the urge to do something, to offer some kind of comfort, gnawed at him, leaving him restless and on edge. There was a day when she didn't come, and George found himself pacing the park in anxious circles. The emptiness of the snow-covered bench felt like a gaping void, a stark reminder of the fragility of life. His mind raced with worries he had no right to feel. Had something happened to her? Was she too unwell to make the journey? The thought of her suffering alone in some distant place filled him with a helpless rage. He cursed himself for being so passive, for allowing fear to hold him back from simply reaching out, from being there for her when she clearly needed someone. But the next day, she was back. George's breath hitched in relief when he saw her, but that relief was short-lived. She was noticeably weaker, her steps more hesitant, as if every movement required all her strength. She sat on the bench and leaned back, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Her hands trembled as she clutched her notebook, but this time, she didn't open it. She simply sat there, as if the effort of even turning a page was too much for her. George stood at a distance, his heart hammering in his chest. He felt the impulse to rush to her side, to offer her his coat, his warmth, anything to ease her suffering. But he remained frozen in place, held back by the invisible wall she had erected around herself. He hated himself for it, for being so close yet unable to do anything that truly mattered. The distance between them was maddening, a barrier that felt both physical and intangible. It was on that day that George made a decision. He couldn't continue like this, watching her fade away, day after day, while doing nothing but standing by. He knew he couldn't force his way into her life, but he could be there, closer than before. He could close the gap, even if it was just by a few feet. And so, the next day, he arrived at the park earlier than usual and took a seat on the bench directly across from hers. It was a small act, a subtle shift in their unspoken routine, but it felt monumental to him. When she arrived, she glanced in his direction for the briefest of moments. Their eyes met, and George's heart skipped a beat. There was a flicker of recognition in her gaze, a silent acknowledgement of his presence. But just as quickly as it came, her eyes returned to her usual vacant stare. She sat down and opened her notebook, but she didn't write. Instead, she simply sat there, her hands resting on the pages, as if the words she sought had finally escaped her. George watched her closely, every detail etched into his mind. The way her breath misted in the cold air, the slight tremor in her hands, the quiet resolve in her posture. He knew he couldn't take away her pain or change whatever fate awaited her, but he could be there. If nothing else, he could be a presence, a witness to her struggle, so that she wouldn't have to face it completely alone. For the next few days, this became their new routine. George would sit across from her, his presence no longer hidden in the shadows, but out in the open. She never acknowledged him directly, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. She seemed more at ease, less burdened by the weight of her thoughts. George noticed that she would glance up from her notebook more often now, her eyes drifting toward the snow-covered trees, the sky, and occasionally toward him. It was as if, in their shared silence, she had come to accept his presence as a small comfort, a silent companion in a world that had grown cold and lonely. The days stretched on, blending together in a blur of frost and fading light. Each visit was marked by the same quiet rhythm. The two of them seated in the park, surrounded by the stark beauty of winter's grip. George began to find a strange solace in those moments. Despite the distance that still separated them, he felt closer to her than ever before. He understood now that words were unnecessary between them. There was a connection formed in the shared silence, in the simple act of being present for one another. But even as this fragile bond grew, George couldn't ignore the signs that time was running out. The toll of her illness was becoming more evident with each passing day. Her face had grown gaunt, her movements slower, and there were moments when she would close her eyes, as if fighting against waves of exhaustion. George's heart ached as he watched her struggle, knowing that he was powerless to change the course of what was to come. The helplessness gnawed at him, a constant reminder that some battles could only be faced alone. One particularly frigid afternoon, as snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, George noticed something different. She arrived later than usual, her steps more unsteady than ever. When she reached the bench, she didn't sit immediately. Instead, she stood there for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the ground. Her shoulders slumped as if the weight she carried had finally grown too heavy. George felt a cold dread settle in his chest as he watched her struggle to lower herself onto the bench, her body trembling with the effort. She didn't open her notebook that day. She simply sat there, staring at the snow, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue from the cold, and her eyes had lost some of the spark that had once been there. George's hands clenched into fists as he fought the urge to rush to her side. He knew that whatever strength she had left was being used to hold on, to cling to her routines, to the small comfort of being in the park, even as her body betrayed her. The snow fell thicker, coating the world in a soft, muffled silence. George sat across from her, his heart heavy with a mixture of sorrow and admiration. She was fighting, even now, in the face of overwhelming odds. But he could see that the fight was nearing its end, that the distance between them was more than just physical. It was the distance between life and the inevitable, the slow, inexorable drift toward a place where he couldn't follow. That day, as dusk began to settle, she finally looked directly at him. Their eyes met across the snow-covered path, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no pretense of not seeing each other. Her gaze was steady, filled with an emotion that George couldn't fully decipher. Was it gratitude, acceptance, or perhaps a silent farewell? Whatever it was, it held a depth that shook him to his core. He didn't need words to understand what she was saying. In that brief, shared look, he knew that she was acknowledging him, not just as a stranger in the park, but as someone who had mattered in these final days. When she finally turned away and rose to leave, George felt a hollow ache in his chest. He watched her walk down the path, her figure growing smaller until she disappeared into the twilight. The snow continued to fall, and the world seemed to hold its breath. George sat there long after she had gone, staring at the empty bench where she had sat, the imprint of her presence still lingering in the air. The distance between them had never felt so vast. Chapter 5. A Quiet Resolve. Winter deepened, tightening its icy grip on the city as January arrived with unrelenting cold. The park had transformed into a world of stark white, where even the bare trees stood like silent sentinels, covered in frost. The snow piled high on the benches, and the paths had become treacherous with ice. Yet, George continued his daily visits, driven by a quiet resolve that had taken root within him. It was no longer just habit or curiosity that brought him back. It was a need to be there, even if only in the background, as a steady presence in her life. He knew by now that she was fighting a battle much greater than anything he could comprehend. Her struggle had become a silent testament to her strength, a resilience that both inspired and haunted him. But with each day, George could see that she was slipping further away, like sand slipping through his fingers. Her steps had become slower, her once determined posture now bent with weariness. There was a fragility to her that was undeniable, and George could feel the inevitable drawing closer like a shadow. The bench where she always sat was now half buried in snow, but she still came. George watched from his usual place across the path as she made her way through the snow-covered park. Her movements were cautious, every step a careful calculation, as if each one might be her last. The scarf around her neck was pulled tight against the biting wind, but it couldn't hide the paleness of her cheeks or the gauntness of her face. Her breath puffed out in misty clouds, a visual reminder of the life that still clung to her, fragile as it was. That day, she didn't bring her notebook. George noticed immediately and felt a pang in his chest. The notebook had been her constant companion, a window into whatever thoughts she kept locked away. Without it, she seemed even more adrift, as if a part of her had been left behind. She sat on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes staring blankly ahead. The snow fell softly around her, covering her coat in a fine layer of white, but she didn't seem to notice. She was still, almost unnaturally so, like a figure carved out of ice. George's heart tightened with a mixture of concern and helplessness. He could see how exhausted she was, how the cold seemed to seep into her bones. The resolve in her eyes was still there, but it was dimming, flickering like a candle in the wind. George had spent weeks observing her, feeling her silent presence weave itself into his own life. He had learned more about himself in those moments of shared silence than he ever had in the years he had spent living on the surface, chasing fleeting thrills and shallow connections. He understood now that this girl, this stranger, had given him something invaluable, a glimpse of what it meant to be truly alive, even in the face of death. She had shown him that strength wasn't about power or control, but about the quiet, unwavering determination to keep moving forward, even when the odds were stacked against you. George couldn't help but feel a deep admiration for her, but with it came a profound sadness that he couldn't shake. He knew that her time was running out, and the thought of losing her, this person he had come to care for, despite barely knowing her, was almost unbearable. The days grew colder, and with each visit, George saw her weakening. There were times when she would sit for hours, barely moving, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. Her eyes, once so sharp and full of life, had dulled, their brightness dimmed by fatigue and pain. George could sense that she was holding on by sheer willpower, driven by something only she understood. But even willpower had its limits, and George could see those limits approaching like the edge of a cliff. He began arriving earlier and staying later, unwilling to miss even a moment of her presence. He wanted to be there, even if only as a distant witness, to whatever time she had left. The park had become a sacred place for him, a sanctuary where he could be with her in silence, sharing in the fleeting beauty of the world, even as that beauty was slowly slipping away. He found himself reflecting on his own life, on the choices he had made, and the person he had become. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of regret. A regret for not having lived with the same quiet resolve that she did, for wasting so much time on things that no longer mattered. There was one particularly cold morning when she didn't arrive. George waited for hours, his eyes scanning the snow-covered paths for any sign of her. The park felt emptier than ever without her, the silence oppressive, suffocating. His thoughts spiraled into dark places. What if something had happened to her? What if she was too ill to come, trapped in a hospital bed or, worse, at the end of her strength, alone in some cold, sterile room? The thought of her suffering alone tore at him, filling him with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. But the next day, she returned. George's heart swelled with relief, though it was tinged with an underlying sorrow. She was different now, more fragile than before, her steps unsteady as she made her way to the bench. Her face was gaunt, her skin almost translucent, as if the light within her was slowly dimming. She moved like someone who had come to terms with the inevitable, yet was determined to make the most of what little time remained. George could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face, the weariness that clung to her like a shroud. When she sat down, she didn't look at the sky or the trees as she usually did. Instead, she lowered her head, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The snow fell steadily, covering the world in a soft, white silence, but she didn't seem to notice. She was lost in her own thoughts, far away from the park, from the world around her. George felt an overwhelming urge to go to her, to break the silence that had defined their connection, to offer some kind of comfort, however small. But he stayed where he was, knowing that his presence was enough for now. He understood that there were battles she needed to face alone, and that his role was simply to bear witness, to be there in the background, offering silent support. The distance between them, though painful, was necessary, a boundary she had set and one he had come to respect. It was in that distance that their connection had grown, not through words, but through the unspoken understanding that came from simply being there for one another. As the day wore on, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. The park was empty, save for the two of them, and the world seemed to hold its breath in the fading light. George watched as she slowly rose from the bench, her body trembling with the effort. She stood for a moment, her eyes closed, as if gathering the strength to take the next step. And then, she turned and began to walk down the path, her figure growing smaller with each step. But this time, before she disappeared into the shadows, she paused and looked back. George's breath caught in his throat as their eyes met across the snow-covered distance. There was something in her gaze, a quiet acknowledgement, a silent message that needed no words. It was as if she was saying goodbye, not in a final sense, but as a recognition of what had passed between them, of the connection they had shared, however brief. Then, with a faint, almost imperceptible nod, she turned and continued down the path, her silhouette fading into the twilight. George remained seated, staring at the spot where she had stood, his heart heavy with emotions he couldn't fully articulate. He knew that this chapter of their story was drawing to a close, that the distance between them was widening in ways he couldn't control. But as the darkness settled in and the snow continued to fall, he also knew that her presence would remain with him, a quiet resolve that would shape him in ways he had never imagined. Even as the distance grew, even as time moved inexorably forward, the memory of her strength, her quiet courage, would stay with him. A reminder that some connections, no matter how brief, leave an indelible mark on the soul. Chapter 6. Fragile Moments. February arrived with a reluctant thaw. The snow that had once blanketed the park now began to melt into gray slush, revealing patches of dead grass and damp earth beneath. The air remained cold, but there were hints of change. Slivers of sunlight breaking through the clouds, the faintest whisper of warmth on the breeze. Yet for all the signs of life returning to the world, the park itself felt more desolate than ever. George had become attuned to the subtle changes in the environment, but more than that, he had become attuned to the changes in her. As the days grew longer and the snow receded, he noticed how she too seemed to be fading. She still came to the park, still sat on the same bench, but there was an undeniable fragility to her now. Her presence, once defined by quiet determination, had grown increasingly frail. It was as if she were a delicate thread, holding on to the world by sheer willpower, but ready to unravel at any moment. George's own emotions had shifted into a quiet ache that lingered with him constantly. He found himself thinking about her even when he wasn't at the park, his thoughts returning to her pale face, her slow, deliberate movements, the distant look in her eyes. He had long accepted that their connection would remain unspoken, that their bond existed only in the silence they shared. But the weight of that silence had grown heavier, pressing down on him like a burden he couldn't shake. The days stretched into weeks, each visit marked by the same routine. George would arrive early, settle into his usual spot across from her, and watch as she made her way down the path. She moved slower now, her steps tentative, as if she were walking on the edge of exhaustion. Her skin had taken on an ashen hue, and there were times when she would stop mid-step, as if gathering the strength to continue. George's heart twisted in his chest each time he saw her struggle, knowing that she was pushing herself beyond her limits just to hold on to these moments in the park. It was during one of these visits, in the fading light of an overcast afternoon, that something shifted. She arrived later than usual, her face drawn with fatigue, her eyes distant. But this time, instead of sitting on her usual bench, she walked past it. George watched with growing concern as she made her way further down the path, her pace slow and unsteady. She seemed disoriented, as if she were searching for something but unsure of what it was. For a brief moment, she paused, her hand reaching out to grip the trunk of a nearby tree for support. George felt a surge of panic rise within him. She looked so small, so fragile, as if a single gust of wind might knock her over. He remained rooted to his spot, torn between wanting to rush to her side and respecting the boundaries she had set. But as he watched her struggle to take another step, he knew he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Slowly, he rose from his bench, taking a few cautious steps toward her. He didn't want to startle her, didn't want to break the delicate balance of their unspoken understanding. But his concern outweighed his hesitation. He kept his movements deliberate, careful, closing the distance between them inch by inch. She hadn't noticed him yet. Her focus was inward, her eyes half closed as she fought against the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. Then, just as she was about to take another step, her legs gave out. George's breath caught in his throat as he saw her stumble, her body crumpling toward the ground. Instinct took over, and he moved faster, crossing the remaining distance in a heartbeat. Before she could fully collapse, he was there, his arms catching her, steadying her as she sagged against him. Her body was impossibly light, as if she were little more than a shadow, a wisp of a person clinging to the last vestiges of life. For a moment, they were frozen in place, the world around them fading into the background. Her head rested against his chest, her breath shallow and rapid. George could feel the tremor in her body, the way her muscles quivered with effort. It was the first time they had touched, the first time he had felt the reality of her fragility. The sensation was overwhelming, a mixture of tenderness and sorrow that pierced through him like a knife. He held her gently, not wanting to break the moment, but also knowing that she needed more than his silent support. Slowly, he guided her to the nearest bench, helping her to sit down. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a fleeting moment, they met his. There was something in her gaze, a mixture of surprise, gratitude, and acceptance. It was as if she had finally allowed herself to lean on someone, to acknowledge that she didn't have to face this alone. Once she was seated, George stepped back, giving her the space she needed. He didn't want to intrude, but he couldn't bring himself to leave her side. She remained still for a long time, her eyes closed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her breathing gradually steadied, though it remained labored. George watched her in silence, his thoughts racing. He felt a profound sense of helplessness, knowing that all he could offer was his presence, that there was nothing he could do to change the course of what was happening. Time seemed to stretch on as the light faded from the sky. The park was deserted, the only sound the occasional rustle of wind through the bare branches. George's mind wandered to all the things he wished he could say to her, the words he wanted to offer as comfort. But he knew that words weren't what she needed. She needed the quiet, the peace that came from simply being in this place, with someone who understood without needing to ask. As dusk settled in, she finally stirred. Her hands unclenched, and she slowly straightened, as if gathering her remaining strength. George could see the toll the day had taken on her. She looked even more frail than before, her movements sluggish. But there was still a spark of determination in her eyes, a resolve that had not yet dimmed completely. She wasn't ready to give up, not yet. When she stood, George stayed close, ready to catch her if she faltered again. But she remained steady, her gaze fixed ahead. With a slight nod, she began to walk, this time heading back in the direction she had come from. George followed at a distance, his steps mirroring hers. He didn't know if she would return the next day, didn't know if this was the beginning of the end, or just another chapter in the ongoing struggle. But he knew that whatever happened, he would be there, as he had been from the start. The walk back was slow, each step deliberate, as if she were savoring every moment, every breath. The path wound through the trees, the branches overhead swaying gently in the breeze. It was a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment of a hospital, a place where life, even in its most fragile state, could still be beautiful. George couldn't help but feel a deep appreciation for the quiet moments they shared, even if those moments were slipping away like grains of sand. When she finally reached the exit of the park, she paused, turning back to look at the path they had walked. Her eyes lingered on the bench where she had spent so many hours, as if she were saying a silent farewell. George watched her from a few steps away, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this might be the last time he would see her in this place. There was a finality in her gaze, a quiet acceptance that spoke volumes. Without a word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the twilight. George remained rooted to the spot, staring at the empty space where she had stood. The park was quiet, the trees casting long shadows across the path. The world felt emptier without her presence, but at the same time, there was a sense of peace. A peace that came from knowing that they had shared something real, something that transcended words. As night fell, George finally turned to leave, his thoughts lingering on her fragile figure, the way she had leaned on him in that brief moment of vulnerability. He knew that their time together was nearing its end, but he also knew that the memory of these quiet moments would stay with him forever, etched into his heart like an indelible mark. Some connections are brief, fleeting, like the last rays of sunlight before night descends. But even in their brevity, they carry a depth and meaning that resonates far beyond the moment. George understood now that the distance between them had never been about physical space. It was about understanding, about being there for someone in the simplest, purest way possible. And for that, he would always be grateful. Chapter 7. Fading Light. March crept in with muted colors and a sense of melancholy in the air. The remnants of winter clung stubbornly to the earth, patches of snow still lingering in shaded corners, while the first buds of spring timidly peeked through. The park had lost much of its wintry beauty, now a mix of slush, bare trees, and damp ground. Yet for George, it remained a place of quiet reflection, an unspoken bond tying him to the memories formed here. George arrived early that day, earlier than usual, feeling an inexplicable restlessness gnawing at him. He found himself standing near the entrance of the park, eyes scanning the path for any sign of her. She had been growing weaker with each passing day, her presence becoming more ghostly, more fleeting. He wondered how long she could continue like this, pushing herself to the brink, refusing to give in, even as her strength visibly dwindled. The minutes ticked by, and still, there was no sign of her. George's mind buzzed with uneasy thoughts. Perhaps today would be the day she wouldn't come. Perhaps her body had finally demanded the rest it so desperately needed. The thought of her confined to a bed, isolated from the world she cherished, filled him with a hollow ache. But just as he was beginning to give in to that fear, he saw her. She moved down the path with the same careful, deliberate steps, her coat hanging loosely on her frail frame. The scarf she always wore was pulled up high, covering most of her face, but George could see the exhaustion in her eyes even from a distance. She looked almost ethereal, as if she were more spirit than flesh, drifting through the world on borrowed time. Today, she didn't head straight for her usual bench. Instead, she walked slowly toward the cluster of trees that bordered the park, where a few stubborn patches of snow remained in the shade. George followed at a distance, his concern growing as he watched her falter slightly, her hand gripping the trunk of a tree for balance. She paused there for a long moment, her eyes half closed as she took in the quiet surroundings. There was something different in her demeanor, a heaviness, a sense of finality that George hadn't seen before. After a while, she began to move again, taking slow, measured steps deeper into the cluster of trees. The canopy above was still mostly bare, allowing the weak sunlight to filter through in streaks, casting long shadows on the ground. She seemed to be following the light, letting it guide her forward. George watched in silence, his heart pounding as he sensed that something was shifting, something beyond his control. Eventually, she reached a small clearing where the ground was carpeted with fallen leaves, damp and dark from the melting snow. She stopped there, standing still in the center of the clearing, her eyes turned upward toward the sky. George could see the strain it took for her to hold herself upright, her body trembling from the effort. Yet there was also a strange serenity in her posture, a calm acceptance that filled the air around her. It was as if she had found some kind of peace, even in the midst of her struggle. George remained on the edge of the clearing, not wanting to intrude on whatever moment she was experiencing. He felt like a spectator in a sacred ritual, witnessing a private communion between her and the world she was slowly leaving behind. The wind rustled through the branches above, sending a few stray leaves tumbling to the ground, their descent soft and gentle. The light danced on her pale skin, highlighting the hollowness of her cheeks, the gaunt lines of her face. She stayed there for what felt like hours, standing in the same spot, her gaze fixed on the sky as if searching for something beyond the clouds. George's thoughts drifted back to the first time he had seen her in this park, how she had seemed so full of life and quiet determination despite the shadow of illness hanging over her. Now, that shadow had grown, consuming more of her with each passing day, yet she had never lost that strength, that defiance against the inevitability of it all. But George could see that she was nearing the end of that fight. Her body had become a vessel of weariness, each breath labored, each movement requiring more effort than the last. Still, she stood there, refusing to let the weight of her exhaustion bring her to her knees. George wondered what thoughts were running through her mind, what memories she was holding onto as she stared at the pale sky. Was she thinking of the life she once had, of the things she had to leave behind? Or was she simply savoring this moment, this brief slice of time where she could feel the world around her, even if only for a little while longer? As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing, she finally lowered her head, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of it all had finally become too much. She took a step forward, her legs nearly buckling beneath her, but she caught herself before she could fall. George's instinct was to rush to her, to offer his support, but he held back, knowing that this was a moment she needed to face on her own. There was a dignity in her struggle, a quiet pride that he couldn't bear to disrupt. She began to make her way back toward the path, her movements slow and unsteady. Each step seemed to take more out of her, but she pressed on, determined to finish this small journey. George followed at a respectful distance, his heart heavy with the knowledge that her time was running out. There was no denying it now. The end was drawing near, and soon this park would no longer be the place where they silently shared their days. When she finally reached the familiar bench, she sank down onto it, her body slumping forward as she clasped her hands together tightly. Her breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, her eyes closed as she rested her head against the back of the bench. The exhaustion was etched into every line of her face, but so was the peace she had found, the acceptance that had finally taken root within her. The evening light cast a golden hue over the park, softening the harsh edges of reality. George stood a short distance away, watching as she simply sat there, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of her chest. The world around them continued its steady march toward dusk, but in that moment, everything felt suspended. Time, sound, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the universe itself had paused, offering her this one last moment of stillness. And in that stillness, George realized something. He had come to the park day after day, driven by an unspoken connection, a need to be near her even in silence. But this was more than that now. What he felt wasn't just concern or admiration. It was something deeper, something that had quietly grown within him without him fully realizing it. It was love, pure and simple, born out of shared moments, silent understanding, and a recognition of the beauty in her quiet strength. But it was a love that came too late, a love that would never have the chance to fully bloom. She was slipping away, and George could do nothing to stop it. All he could do was bear witness, to be there for her in these final days, offering what little comfort his presence could provide. As night descended and the first stars appeared in the sky, she slowly rose from the bench, swaying slightly before steadying herself. She turned to leave, her steps faltering as she made her way down the darkening path. George followed, his heart aching with the knowledge that this might be one of the last times he would see her. At the park's entrance, she paused, glancing back one final time. Her gaze lingered on the path, on the trees, and then on George, who stood just a few steps behind her. For a brief moment, their eyes met in the gathering darkness, and in that gaze, there was a quiet goodbye, a recognition of what had been shared, of what could never be. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the night. George remained standing there, the emptiness of the park echoing in the silence that followed. The light had faded, both in the world and in his heart, leaving him with nothing but memories and the knowledge that some stories are meant to be brief, no matter how much they are cherished. He knew he would return to the park the next day, and the day after that, but it would never be the same. The place that had once held the promise of connection now carried the weight of loss. But in that loss, there was also a quiet resolve, a determination to honor what had been, even if it was fleeting. And so, with a heavy heart, George turned and walked home, the fading light of day a reflection of the fragile moments he had come to treasure, moments that would stay with him long after they were gone. Chapter 8. The Hospital Visit. The crisp, sterile scent of the hospital lingered in the air, a mix of antiseptic, cold metal, and faint traces of old flowers. George's footsteps echoed down the long, pale corridor as he walked with a deliberate slowness, the world around him feeling muted and distant. The walls were lined with bland paintings meant to offer a touch of warmth, but they only highlighted the lifelessness of the place. This wasn't a world of warmth. It was a world where time stretched thin, where every minute carried the weight of dread and fragile hope. He hadn't been here before. Their connection had always been rooted in the park, in the quiet spaces they shared, surrounded by nature and light. But that world felt far away now, replaced by harsh fluorescent lights and the hum of machines. She wasn't there anymore. She was here, confined to a bed where the fight was becoming more and more one-sided. George approached the room with a sense of hesitation, his heart beating heavily in his chest. He could see her through the narrow glass window on the door, lying still, covered in a white sheet that seemed to blend into the paleness of her skin. The room was dimly lit, only a small lamp in the corner casting a soft glow. Everything felt shrunken, as if the world had been reduced to this small, sterile box. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The soft beep of monitors filled the silence, a rhythmic reminder of the fragile line she was walking. Tubes and wires snaked from her body, connecting her to the machines that were now doing the work her body could no longer manage on its own. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, the only sign of life in an otherwise still form. George took a seat in the chair beside her bed, his eyes fixed on her face. The last time he had seen her, she had been standing under the open sky, fragile but still fighting. Now, she looked like a shadow of herself, thin, almost translucent, her hair spread like a dull halo across the pillow. There was a stillness to her that made his heart ache, a resignation, as if she had accepted that this battle was nearing its end. He wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to offer some small comfort through touch, but he hesitated. What could he give her in this moment that would matter? What could he possibly do to ease the suffering that had become her constant companion? The helplessness he felt was overwhelming, a knot tightening in his chest as he sat there, unable to change anything, unable to do anything except be present. The minutes ticked by in heavy silence. George's gaze never wavered from her face, studying the lines of exhaustion etched into her features. Her skin was almost paper-thin, with dark circles under her eyes, signs of the endless nights spent in discomfort and pain. The machines continued their steady rhythm, a cold and mechanical soundtrack to the scene unfolding before him. His thoughts wandered back to the park, to the days when she would walk slowly down the path, her eyes always drawn to the light filtering through the trees. He remembered the way she'd stop and look up, as if drawing strength from those brief moments of sunlight. He wondered if she was doing the same now, if somewhere in the depths of her mind, she was imagining herself back in that place of peace, surrounded by the gentle rustling of leaves and the warmth of the sun. Time seemed to blur, the hours melting together as George remained by her side. Nurses came and went, their movements quiet and efficient as they adjusted the machines, checked her vitals, and murmured brief updates. George barely noticed them. His attention was wholly consumed by her, by the stillness that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. There were no words spoken, no conversations exchanged, but the silence carried its own weight. It was a silence filled with everything left unsaid, with all the thoughts and emotions George had kept locked away, knowing that words would never be enough. He had spent weeks, months, understanding her without needing to speak, and now, in this final stretch, he clung to that understanding more than ever. The hours dragged on, and eventually, night began to fall. The shadows lengthened in the room, the dim glow of the lamp casting an almost ethereal light over her still form. George felt a deep fatigue settle into his bones, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Leaving would mean acknowledging that the end was near, that there might not be another tomorrow for her. And so, he stayed, his hand resting on the arm of the chair, mere inches away from her own frail hand. There was a sudden flutter in her eyelids, a faint movement that drew his attention. Her eyes slowly opened, unfocused at first, but gradually sharpening as they took in the room. She blinked once, twice, and then her gaze drifted to him. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and George saw something flicker there. A faint spark of recognition, of acknowledgement. It was the briefest of moments, a fleeting connection that held everything between them. There was no need for words, no need for explanations. Everything they had shared, everything they had felt, was encapsulated in that one silent exchange. George felt a tear slide down his cheek, but he made no move to wipe it away. He let it fall, a silent testament to the love and loss intertwining in his heart. Her eyes closed again, her face relaxing into an expression of quiet peace. George leaned back in his chair, his own eyes heavy with exhaustion. He knew, deep down, that this would be one of the last times he would see her like this, alive, even if only just. The machines kept their steady rhythm, the monitors blinking with numbers he didn't want to interpret. The world outside the room continued as normal, indifferent to the moment unfolding within these four walls. As the night deepened, George's thoughts turned to the future, to a time when he would have to carry on without her. The idea of returning to the park alone, of walking the paths they had shared in silence, filled him with a hollow emptiness. But he also knew that he would return, because that was where her memory would live on, among the trees, in the shifting light, in the gentle rustle of leaves. The hours stretched on, the quiet hum of machines and the occasional murmur of nurses the only sounds. George's exhaustion eventually won out, and he leaned forward, resting his head on the edge of her bed. The fabric of the sheet was cool against his forehead, and he closed his eyes, letting himself drift into a restless sleep, his thoughts still filled with images of her, walking in the park, standing in the clearing, gazing at the sky. In that quiet room, time seemed to stand still. The world outside moved on, unaware of the small, fragile life that was slowly slipping away. But within that space, George kept vigil, holding on to every precious second, every fading breath, knowing that this was the only way he could honor her, to simply be there in the silence until the end. Chapter 9. The first signs of farewell. Spring slowly took hold of the world outside, but within the hospital room, time felt suspended. The days blurred together as George remained at her side, watching over her with a quiet resolve. The once vibrant light in her eyes had dulled, replaced by a distant haze as her body began to succumb to the relentless illness. Her breaths were becoming shallower, her movements more infrequent, and with every passing hour, the weight of what was coming pressed down on George's heart. He no longer kept track of the days. Whether it was morning or night had become irrelevant. The routine had become a grim rhythm. sitting in the stiff hospital chair, holding her cold hand, and staring at the monitors that measured life in numbers and beeps. But those numbers told a story he wished he could ignore. Her pulse was slowing, her blood pressure dropping, the lines on the screen tracing a path that led only one way. Outside the window, the world was full of new life. Flowers blooming, trees budding, the sun breaking through clouds with renewed warmth. Yet, in this small room, life was retreating. The contrast was cruel, almost mocking. George would sometimes catch glimpses of children running through the hospital garden below, their laughter drifting faintly upward. But it felt distant, part of a reality that no longer belonged to him. One afternoon, a sudden burst of sunlight filled the room, casting long shadows on the walls. The golden light streamed across her bed, illuminating her frail form, making her seem almost ethereal. George stood up slowly and moved closer to the window, pulling the curtains back slightly to let more light in. For a brief moment, the room was bathed in a warm glow, a small comfort amidst the cold sterility of the hospital. He turned back to her, watching as the sunlight caressed her face. Her eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular breaths. The light softened her features, smoothing out the lines of pain that had become etched into her skin. For a fleeting second, she looked almost like the girl he had first seen in the park, the one who had walked with a quiet strength, who had seemed determined to savor every moment despite the illness that shadowed her. But that girl was almost gone now, replaced by this fragile figure, clinging to the last threads of life. George's heart clenched as he took in the sight of her, knowing that the end was close. There were no miracles here, no last-minute reprieves. There was only this slow, inevitable decline, a farewell that was being drawn out over days instead of moments. He pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down, resting his hand on hers. Her skin was cool to the touch, her fingers barely responding to his. George traced the lines of her hand, memorizing every crease and curve, every small imperfection. He wanted to hold on to these details, to etch them into his memory so that when she was gone, he would still have this part of her to carry with him. The minutes ticked by, marked only by the steady hum of the machines and the distant sounds of hospital life. Footsteps in the hall, the creak of a door, the occasional muffled cough. George's mind wandered back to the beginning, to that first encounter in the park when they had shared a silent understanding. He thought about how much had changed since then, how his life had shifted in ways he never could have predicted. She had been the catalyst for that change, showing him a side of himself he hadn't known existed. A man capable of deep, unwavering love, of selflessness and devotion. But now, that love was tinged with a sharp sorrow, knowing that it could only be expressed in these final, fleeting moments. There would be no more walks in the park, no more quiet afternoons shared in the dappled light of the trees. All that remained was this small room, this sterile environment where life slowly ebbed away. As the afternoon light began to fade, so did her strength. George could see it in the way her chest struggled to rise, the slight twitch of her fingers as if she were fighting to hold on. Her body was shutting down, one piece at a time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The helplessness he felt was almost suffocating, a crushing weight on his chest. But he stayed there, his grip tightening on her hand, silently willing her to know that she wasn't alone. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room into shadow. The glow of the monitors became more prominent, their blinking lights the only source of illumination. George didn't move, didn't dare close his eyes for fear that she might slip away in that brief instant of darkness. He wanted to be awake, to be present, to bear witness to her final moments. It was the only way he knew to honor her, to repay the love and strength she had shown him. As night fell, her breathing grew more labored, each inhale a painful struggle. The rhythm of the machines slowed, their beeps becoming fewer and farther between. George leaned closer, his face inches from hers, watching for any sign of awareness. But she was far away now, somewhere beyond reach, slipping further with each passing second. Time stretched, suspended in the silence of the room. And then, in the early hours of the morning, it happened. There was a long pause between breaths, a pause that stretched on just a little too long. George's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat as he waited for the next rise of her chest. But it didn't come. The monitors let out a long, sustained tone, a single, final note that marked the end. George closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him, a bitter confirmation of what he already knew. She was gone. The room was plunged into a deep, unbearable quiet, the kind that only comes in the wake of something profound. George remained where he was, his hands still resting on hers, now cold and lifeless. The tears came slowly at first, then in waves, silent and uncontrollable. He wept for everything that had been lost, the love, the hope, the future that had been snatched away too soon. But he also wept for her release, knowing that her suffering had finally come to an end. Outside, the first light of dawn began to break, casting a faint glow through the window. The world continued to turn, indifferent to the small tragedy that had unfolded in that room. But for George, everything had changed. The love that had grown so quietly, so naturally, had reached its inevitable conclusion, leaving him with nothing but memories and the pain of an empty heart. He stayed there for hours, unwilling to leave her side, knowing that this was the last time he would ever be with her. And in that final moment, as the sun rose on a new day, George silently promised to carry her memory with him always, to honor her, not in words, but in the life he would live from this day forward. And so, with the first rays of morning light spilling into the room, he kissed her hand one last time and whispered his farewell, not with words, but with a tear that fell softly onto her pale skin, a single, silent testament to a love that, even in its brevity, had changed him forever. Chapter 10. The Funeral. The day of the funeral arrived with a heavy sky, gray and oppressive, mirroring the weight in George's heart. The world outside seemed to hold its breath as he made his way to the small church where the service would take place. The streets were quiet, the usual hustle and bustle of daily life muted under the somber veil of the weather. George walked slowly, each step feeling like an effort, his mind numb with grief and disbelief. The church was modest but dignified, its stone facade and stained glass windows creating an atmosphere of solemn reverence. George entered through the heavy wooden doors, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of lilies and the faint trace of incense. The pews were filled with friends and family, their faces a blur of muted colors and tear-streaked expressions. George took a seat near the front, his eyes fixed on the small, simple casket that stood at the altar. It was draped with flowers, white roses and lilies, their delicate petals a stark contrast to the dark wood of the casket. The arrangement was understated but elegant, a final tribute to a life that had been both beautiful and brief. The flowers seemed almost to weep, their fragrance mingling with the heavy silence of the room. He scanned the faces of those gathered, seeing the sorrow reflected in each pair of eyes. The faces of her family, her friends, each of them a reminder of the life she had touched, the connections she had forged. They were all here, bound together by their shared loss, their shared love for the girl who had left them far too soon. The service began with quiet dignity, the slow, measured cadence of hymns filling the air. The words were inaudible to George, lost in the overwhelming sense of finality that hung over him. The music was soft and mournful, a delicate counterpoint to the heavy weight of the moment. Each note seemed to echo through the church, reverberating off the walls, touching every corner of the space. As the service progressed, George's gaze drifted to the stained glass windows. The images depicted scenes of peace and hope, angels, serene landscapes, and soft, comforting light. They seemed almost out of place in the context of the grief that filled the room. But they also offered a fleeting sense of solace, a reminder that there might be something beyond this final farewell. The eulogies, delivered with reverence and respect, spoke of her kindness, her strength, her grace. But to George, the words were little more than a blur, a mere formality in the face of a loss that defied description. He had spent so many hours simply being with her, understanding her without words, and now, at this final moment, the emptiness was almost unbearable. When the time came for the procession to the graveside, George followed behind the casket, walking with measured steps. The air outside was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the church. The cemetery was a quiet, tranquil place, its landscape dotted with gravestones and surrounded by tall, leafy trees. It seemed almost serene, as if the world had paused to honor the moment. The casket was lowered into the ground with a slow, deliberate grace, each movement accompanied by the soft rustling of the gathered mourners. George stood at the edge of the grave, his hands clasped tightly together. The sight of the casket being lowered, the finality of it, struck him with a profound sadness. This was the end of their shared journey, the end of a chapter that had been filled with so much promise and so much pain. The ritual of laying flowers on the casket followed, a symbolic gesture of farewell. George watched as friends and family stepped forward, each placing a bloom onto the casket, their faces etched with grief. The flowers were a vibrant array of colors, a final burst of life in a moment of profound loss. George's own offering was a single white rose, its petals delicate and fragrant. He placed it gently on top of the casket, his fingers lingering for a moment as he said his silent goodbye. As the crowd began to disperse, George remained by the grave, his gaze fixed on the newly filled earth. The grave was a small, inconspicuous mound amidst the sea of other markers, but to him, it was the center of the universe, a place where his love and his loss were intertwined. The reality of it all was sinking in, the finality of her absence becoming more palpable with each passing second. The sky above began to clear as the day wore on, the gray clouds giving way to patches of blue. The light seemed almost too bright, too cheerful, in contrast to the solemnity of the occasion. George walked slowly back to the car, his steps heavy with the burden of his grief. The world was moving on, indifferent to the heartache that had settled so deeply within him. As he drove away from the cemetery, he glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing the small figure of the cemetery disappearing behind him. The landscape seemed to blur together, the colors merging into a single, muted palette. The road ahead stretched out before him, a path that he would have to navigate alone, without the presence that had once given his life so much meaning. The drive back to his apartment felt interminable, the silence of the car a stark contrast to the noise of the service. He arrived home and went straight to the small desk in the corner of his living room, where he had begun to work on the book he had promised himself he would write. The pages were blank, waiting for the words that would capture the essence of what they had shared, the depth of his love, and the pain of his loss. As he sat there, pen in hand, he realized that the task ahead was daunting. How could he possibly convey the complexity of his emotions, the richness of their connection, in mere words? How could he make others understand the profound impact she had had on his life? The enormity of it all was overwhelming, but he knew he had to try. It was the only way he could honor her memory, the only way he could make sense of the heartache that had become his constant companion. With a deep breath, he began to write, the pen moving slowly across the page as he tried to find the right words. The task was immense, but he was determined to see it through. For in those pages, he hoped to capture not just the essence of their love, but also the way it had transformed him, the way it had left an indelible mark on his soul. And so, as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, George wrote into the night, his heart heavy but his spirit resolute. The words came slowly, each one a testament to the love he had lost and the hope he still clung to. The journey was just beginning, but he knew that it was a journey he had to make. One that would take him through the pain and into a future where he could remember her with both sorrow and gratitude. Chapter 11. The Empty Apartment. The apartment felt hollow, a mere shell of the life that had once filled it with warmth and laughter. The echoes of their shared moments seemed to linger in the air, a bittersweet reminder of what had been lost. George moved through the space with a heavy heart, his steps muted on the hardwood floors, each room a testament to the memories that now felt distant and unreachable. He wandered into the living room, where the furniture stood as if waiting for their return. The couch, once a place of shared conversations and quiet moments, was now a silent witness to his solitude. The bookshelves, lined with their favorite reads and trinkets collected over time, seemed to mock him with their stillness. The pictures on the walls, snapshots of happier times, were frozen in moments of joy that now felt like a distant dream. George sat down at the desk where he had started working on the book. The empty pages stared back at him, a blank canvas for the emotions he struggled to articulate. He glanced at the framed photo of Emily on the desk, her smile captured in a moment of unguarded happiness. The photo was a poignant reminder of her presence, a small piece of her that remained even as she was no longer there. He reached out and gently touched the frame, his fingers tracing the outline of her face. The gesture was one of both reverence and sorrow, a silent acknowledgement of the love that had been and the loss that now defined his days. The photo was one of many throughout the apartment, each one a fragment of a shared life now reduced to memories. As he continued to move through the apartment, he found himself drawn to the bedroom, where the bed remained untouched, the sheets neatly tucked in place. The room was still and quiet, the absence of her presence stark against the mundane backdrop of everyday life. George sat on the edge of the bed, his hands resting in his lap as he stared at the empty space beside him. The closet was a testament to her presence, filled with clothes that no longer had a wearer. He opened the door and ran his fingers over the fabric of her dresses, the softness of the material a painful reminder of her absence. The closet was meticulously organized, just as she had kept it, each item in its place, a reflection of her attention to detail and her love for order. George's gaze fell on a small jewelry box on the dresser, its lid slightly ajar. He opened it carefully, revealing a collection of delicate pieces, necklaces, bracelets, rings, all remnants of her life. He picked up a bracelet and held it in his hand, the cool metal a sharp contrast to the warmth he remembered. The bracelet was simple yet elegant, a small piece of her that he could hold on to. As the afternoon sun filtered through the window, casting a soft glow across the room, George found himself sitting at the small table in the kitchen. The table was set for two, a small reminder of the meals they had shared. The kitchen, with its neatly arranged dishes and spotless countertops, was now a place of emptiness, the absence of her presence a void that seemed to stretch endlessly. George took a deep breath and stood up, moving back to the living room where he began sorting through the remnants of their life together. He packed away her belongings with careful deliberation, each item a piece of the puzzle that had once been their life. The process was both therapeutic and heart-wrenching, a way to confront the reality of her absence while holding onto the fragments of their shared history. The apartment gradually transformed from a living space into a repository of memories, the personal touches that had once defined their home now packed away in boxes. George worked through the afternoon, his movements mechanical but steady, driven by the need to find some semblance of order in the chaos of his emotions. As evening fell, the apartment was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of packing materials. George stood in the center of the living room, looking around at the emptiness that now filled the space. The absence of her belongings created a stark contrast to the warmth that had once permeated the apartment. The silence was almost palpable, a constant reminder of the void left by her departure. He sank into the couch, exhaustion settling over him as he gazed at the now barren walls. The apartment, once a place of shared dreams and love, had become a testament to solitude and grief. George's heart ached with a deep sense of loss, the weight of it pressing heavily on his chest. The sun had set, and the first stars began to appear in the night sky, their faint light filtering through the windows. George remained in the dim light of the living room, surrounded by the remnants of their life together. The emptiness of the apartment seemed to echo the emptiness in his heart, a reflection of the profound sense of loss that had become his constant companion. In the quiet of the night, George allowed himself to sit in the silence, to be present with his grief. The apartment was a mirror of his soul, a place once filled with love and now marked by a profound and unrelenting absence. And as he sat there, surrounded by the shadows of what had been, he found himself searching for a way to move forward, to find meaning in the emptiness that had come to define his world. Chapter 12. The book begins. In the dim light of his apartment, George sat at the small desk that had become his refuge, the place where he sought solace in the act of writing. The blank pages of the notebook before him seemed to loom larger with each passing moment, their emptiness a daunting challenge. The room was quiet, save for the faint rustling of the pages as George flipped through them, trying to find the right words to begin his journey of remembering and honoring Emily. The desk was cluttered with pens, notebooks, and photographs, each a small piece of the puzzle he was trying to assemble. He picked up one of the photos, the same one he had touched at the funeral, and stared at it for a long time. Emily's smile was captured in a moment of pure joy, a stark contrast to the sadness that now enveloped him. The photograph was a reminder of her life, her essence, and the love they had shared. He placed it gently back on the desk, feeling the weight of his task pressing down on him. George picked up a pen and hesitated before putting it to paper. The blank page seemed to taunt him, daring him to find the words that would encapsulate the depth of his feelings, the beauty of their relationship, and the pain of their separation. He took a deep breath and began to write, the ink flowing across the page in uneven strokes. The words came slowly at first, each one carefully considered as he sought to capture the essence of what had been lost. He wrote of their first meeting, the chance encounter in the park that had set their lives on a new course. He wrote of the quiet moments they had shared, the way their lives had intertwined in a dance of love and understanding. The memories flowed from his pen, each one a fragment of the whole, each one a testament to the life they had built together. As he wrote, George felt a sense of catharsis. The act of putting his thoughts onto paper was a way to process his grief, to give shape to the emotions that had been swirling inside him since Emily's passing. The words were a reflection of his love, his pain, and his determination to keep her memory alive. The process was both painful and healing, a way to confront the void left by her absence while celebrating the moments they had shared. The hours slipped away as George continued to write, his focus narrowing to the task at hand. The apartment was dark now, the only light coming from the small desk lamp that cast a warm glow over the pages. The outside world was a distant blur, the noise and activity of daily life forgotten in the quiet solitude of his writing. As he reached the end of the page, George paused and looked at what he had written. The words were imperfect, but they were a start. an attempt to capture the essence of their love and the impact it had on his life. He felt a sense of accomplishment, even amidst the lingering sadness. The book was a way to preserve Emily's memory, to honor the love they had shared, and to find a way forward in the midst of his grief. He closed the notebook and placed it carefully on the desk, his heart heavy but his spirit slightly lighter. The act of writing had given him a sense of purpose, a way to channel his sorrow into something tangible. The book was still in its early stages, but it was a beginning, a small but significant step toward finding solace and meaning in the wake of loss. George sat back in his chair and looked around the room, the familiar surroundings now imbued with a new sense of significance. The apartment, once a place of shared memories, was now the setting for his journey of remembrance. The silence of the room was no longer just a reminder of his solitude, but a space where he could honor Emily and begin to heal. The night wore on, and George remained at his desk, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating his work. The process of writing was far from easy, but it was a necessary part of his healing. As he looked at the pages filled with his thoughts and memories, he felt a sense of determination to continue, to complete the book, and to keep Emily's memory alive in the only way he knew how. In the quiet of the night, George took comfort in the small progress he had made. The book was a reflection of his love and his grief, a testament to the life they had shared. And as he prepared to close his notebook and turn off the lamp, he knew that while the journey ahead would be long and difficult, it was one that he had to undertake. For in the pages of his book, he hoped to find not just a way to remember Emily, but also a path to healing and a future where her memory could live on. Chapter 13. A Glimpse of Normalcy. The days following Emily's funeral settled into a routine of sorts, a new normal that George found both comforting and unsettling. The apartment, though still filled with remnants of their shared life, began to take on a new rhythm. The routines he once shared with Emily were now solitary rituals, each one a reminder of the emptiness left behind. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the window, George decided to venture outside. The fresh air and the change of scenery were meant to offer some respite from the suffocating stillness of the apartment. He put on his coat and stepped out into the crisp autumn air, the cool breeze a sharp contrast to the warmth of the indoors. The city was alive with activity, its streets bustling with people going about their daily lives. The sounds of traffic, distant conversations, and the hum of the city seemed almost alien after the quiet of his apartment. George walked slowly, taking in the sights and sounds around him, trying to reconnect with a world that had seemed so distant in his grief. He wandered through the park, the trees standing tall with their autumn leaves turning brilliant shades of orange and red. The park had been one of their favorite places, a spot where they had spent countless afternoons walking hand in hand. Seeing it now, devoid of Emily's presence, was a bittersweet reminder of what had been lost. He walked the familiar paths, each step a mixture of nostalgia and sorrow. As he continued through the park, he noticed a small cafe with outdoor seating. The sight of it, its inviting atmosphere and the aroma of coffee drifting through the air, seemed to beckon him. He decided to stop for a moment, hoping that a brief respite might offer some solace. Inside the cafe, the warmth and the gentle murmur of conversation created a comforting environment. George ordered a coffee and sat at a small table by the window. The cafe, with its cozy ambience and the soft light filtering through the glass, provided a temporary escape from the heaviness of his emotions. He sipped his coffee slowly, the warmth of the drink contrasting with the coolness of the autumn air outside. The cafe was filled with people, each absorbed in their own conversations or lost in their thoughts. The normalcy of it all, the everyday life that continued unabated, seemed both reassuring and unsettling. George watched the people around him, their lives unfolding in a way that felt disconnected from his own experience of grief. After finishing his coffee, George left the cafe and continued his walk through the city. The familiar sights and sounds began to weave a subtle sense of normalcy into his day, offering a fleeting distraction from the pain he carried with him. He wandered through shops, glanced at window displays, and observed the ebb and flow of people moving about their day. The city seemed to be moving in its usual rhythm, a stark contrast to the inner turmoil he felt. As the day drew to a close, George returned to his apartment, his steps slower and more reflective. The sunlight was fading, casting long shadows across the streets. The city lights began to flicker on, creating a warm glow against the encroaching darkness. Back at home, George felt a sense of quiet acceptance. The apartment, though still filled with reminders of Emily, seemed to have taken on a new layer of meaning. The routines of daily life, the small activities that once seemed trivial, now offered a semblance of stability in the midst of his grief. He returned to his writing, the notebook open before him on the desk. The words flowed more easily now, the act of writing becoming a comforting ritual. The reflections from his day, his walk through the park, the brief respite at the cafe, found their way into the pages. Each word he wrote was a step towards processing his grief and finding a way to move forward. As the evening settled in, George looked around his apartment with a renewed sense of purpose. The small changes, the moments of normalcy he had experienced, had offered him a glimpse of a future beyond his grief. While the pain of Emily's absence was still raw and profound, the routine of daily life and the act of writing provided a way to navigate through it. The chapter closed with George preparing for the night, his heart a mixture of sorrow and hope. The day had offered a brief respite from the weight of his emotions, a reminder that life, even in the face of loss, continued to move forward. And as he turned off the lights and settled into bed, he felt a glimmer of optimism for the days ahead, knowing that while the journey of grief was far from over, there were moments of solace to be found along the way. Chapter 14. The Gathering. The days passed in a steady, reflective pace, each one blending into the next with a rhythm both comforting and monotonous. One morning, George received an invitation to a small gathering, a gathering to remember Emily and celebrate her life. The invitation was simple, yet its arrival stirred a mix of anticipation and anxiety within him. On the day of the gathering, George prepared with a sense of quiet resolve. He dressed in a dark suit, the solemnity of the occasion reflected in his choice. As he left his apartment and stepped out into the crisp air, he felt the weight of the day ahead. The city, now familiar and routine, seemed to take on a different hue, its usual vibrancy dimmed by the gravity of the occasion. The gathering was held at a modest but elegant venue, a community hall adorned with photographs and mementos of Emily's life. The room was softly lit, creating an atmosphere of warmth and remembrance. The walls were decorated with pictures of Emily, each one capturing a moment of joy, a glimpse of her radiant smile, and the essence of her spirit. The photos were interspersed with flowers and candles, their gentle glow adding a touch of serenity to the space. George arrived and took in the scene with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. He was greeted by familiar faces, friends and family who had come together to honor Emily's memory. Though the gathering was a somber occasion, there was a shared sense of community and support among those present. The room was filled with the quiet hum of conversations, each person offering their own silent tribute to the girl they had known and loved. George moved through the room, his eyes scanning the photographs and mementos displayed around him. Each image was a reflection of Emily's life, a tapestry of experiences, milestones, and memories. He paused at a display featuring some of her favorite things: books she loved, trinkets she had collected, and handwritten notes that spoke of her dreams and passions. The display was a poignant reminder of the depth of her character and the impact she had on those around her. As the afternoon progressed, George found a quiet corner where he could reflect on the significance of the gathering. He observed the interactions around him, the gentle exchanges of stories and memories that spoke to the richness of Emily's life. The room was filled with a sense of shared loss, but also with a profound appreciation for the person she had been. The event included a slideshow of images set to soft, instrumental music, a visual journey through Emily's life. George watched the images flicker across the screen, each one evoking a different emotion. The photographs captured moments of laughter, love, and friendship, painting a vivid picture of the person Emily had been. The music, tender and evocative, added an additional layer of emotion to the experience. After the slideshow, people began to gather around a table laden with refreshments. A simple offering of food and drink meant to provide comfort and companionship. George joined the group, his presence a quiet testament to the shared grief and collective effort to honor Emily's memory. The conversations were subdued, the atmosphere one of respectful reflection. The afternoon drew to a close, and the gathering began to wind down. George took one last look around the room, taking in the collective tribute to Emily's life. The photographs, the candles, and the flowers had created a space of remembrance, a place where her memory could be cherished and celebrated. As he prepared to leave, George felt a mixture of sadness and solace. The gathering had provided him with a sense of connection to others who had loved Emily, a reminder that he was not alone in his grief. The shared experience of remembering her had offered a moment of collective healing, a chance to honor her life and find comfort in the company of others who understood the depth of his loss. The evening air was cool as George walked back to his apartment. The city, now dimly lit and quiet, seemed to offer a sense of calm. The gathering had been a step towards finding peace, a moment of respite in the ongoing journey of grief. As he returned to his apartment and prepared for bed, George reflected on the day's events with a sense of quiet gratitude. The gathering had been a meaningful tribute, a reminder of the love that had surrounded Emily and the impact she had left on the world. Chapter 15. The Unfinished Manuscript. In the solitude of his apartment, George continued to devote himself to the book he was writing. The process was both therapeutic and demanding, requiring him to delve deeply into memories and emotions that were sometimes painful to revisit. The manuscript was a reflection of his journey, a tribute to Emily and the life they had shared. However, as the days passed, he began to struggle with how to convey the depth of his grief and the complexity of their relationship. One morning, George sat at his desk, surrounded by scattered pages and notes. The once clear narrative now felt tangled, the words elusive and difficult to capture. He stared at the manuscript, the pages filled with his efforts, but still lacking the coherence he desired. The task seemed overwhelming, and the weight of the project felt heavier than ever. He looked around the room, at the photographs and mementos of Emily that adorned the space. Each item was a reminder of their shared life, a piece of the puzzle he was trying to assemble. The photographs, in particular, were both a source of comfort and a challenge. They captured moments of joy and love, but also highlighted the gap left by her absence. George picked up a photo of Emily, her smile radiating a warmth that felt distant now. He placed the photo next to his manuscript, seeking inspiration from the image of the person he had loved so deeply. The photo, with its vivid colors and joyful expression, seemed to offer a silent encouragement. It was a reminder of the beauty and light that Emily had brought into his life, a guiding beacon for the words he was struggling to find. Despite the encouragement from the photo, the writing process remained arduous. George found himself rewriting and revising, his frustration mounting as he sought to capture the essence of his experiences and emotions. The manuscript felt like an unfinished tapestry, its threads frayed and incomplete. In an attempt to break through the creative block, George took a break and walked through the apartment, reflecting on the memories and moments he wanted to include in the book. He visited the places where they had spent time together: his study, their favorite corner of the park, the cafe where they had shared so many conversations. Each location was a fragment of their shared history, a piece of the larger story he was trying to tell. Returning to his desk, George resumed his writing with a renewed sense of determination. He focused on specific memories: their first trip together, the small gestures of love and support, the moments of laughter and intimacy. He tried to channel the emotions associated with these memories into the manuscript, allowing himself to be vulnerable and honest in his writing. As the day drew to a close, George looked over the pages he had written. The manuscript was still incomplete, but there was a sense of progress. He had managed to capture some of the essence of their relationship, though there was still much work to be done. The process was slow, each word a reflection of his ongoing struggle to articulate the depth of his feelings. The evening settled in, and George prepared to rest. The manuscript lay on his desk, a testament to his efforts and his journey through grief. The apartment was quiet, the soft light of the desk lamp casting a gentle glow over the pages. George felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination, knowing that the road ahead was still long, but feeling a sense of accomplishment in the progress he had made. As he turned off the light and headed to bed, George reflected on the day's work. The manuscript, though still unfinished, was a crucial part of his healing process. It was a way to honor Emily's memory, to preserve the love they had shared, and to find a way to move forward. The journey was ongoing, but each step he took brought him closer to completing the book and finding solace in the pages that told their story. Chapter 16: Echoes of the Past. The transition from summer to fall marked a subtle shift in George's routine. The crisp air and falling leaves served as a constant reminder of the passage of time, each day a step further from the life he had once shared with Emily. The apartment, though familiar, now seemed to carry a lingering sense of her absence. One afternoon, George found himself sorting through old boxes in the closet, boxes filled with remnants of their life together. He had avoided them for some time, but today, the task of sifting through these belongings seemed like a necessary step in his healing process. With careful hands, he opened the first box and began to pull out its contents. The box was filled with an assortment of items: old letters, postcards from their travels, and keepsakes from special occasions. Each item was a fragment of their shared history, a physical reminder of moments filled with joy and love. George took his time, handling each piece with reverence and care. He unfolded letters and examined postcards, each one evoking a particular memory. Among the items was a small, leather-bound journal, Emily's journal. George had seen her writing in it occasionally, though he had never read its contents. The journal was worn with use, its pages filled with Emily's delicate handwriting. He carefully opened it to a random page, and as he read her words, he felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The entries were intimate reflections of her thoughts and dreams, written with the same tenderness that had characterized their relationship. The journal entries spoke of her hopes for the future, her reflections on their life together, and her deep love for George. Each word was a window into Emily's inner world, revealing the depth of her emotions and the significance of their time together. As George read, he felt a renewed connection to her, a poignant reminder of the bond they had shared. He closed the journal and placed it gently back in the box. The act of revisiting these items, of engaging with Emily's personal reflections, was both comforting and painful. It was a reminder of the life they had built together, but also a stark acknowledgement of her absence. The afternoon wore on as George continued to sort through the boxes. Each item he encountered was a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of the past that contributed to the story he was trying to tell in his book. The process was a mixture of nostalgia and grief, a way to engage with his memories while confronting the reality of his loss. As evening approached, George carefully packed the items back into the boxes, taking a moment to appreciate the significance of each piece. The process had been emotional, but it had also provided him with a deeper understanding of his journey and the love he had shared with Emily. Returning to his desk, George reflected on the day's discoveries. The items from the boxes, the journal entries, and the mementos had offered him new insights and a renewed sense of connection to Emily. He resumed his writing with a renewed focus, the echoes of the past providing inspiration and depth to his work. The chapter ended with George's quiet contemplation of the day's events. The process of revisiting the past had been both challenging and healing, a way to honor Emily's memory and to find solace in the fragments of their shared life. As he prepared for the night, he felt a sense of calm resolve. The journey through grief continued, but with each step, he was moving closer to completing the manuscript and finding a way to preserve Emily's memory in a meaningful way. Chapter 17. A Fragile Hope. The early winter chill had settled into the city, and George felt the crispness of the air each time he stepped outside. The apartment was bathed in a soft, golden light from the setting sun, creating a serene but melancholic atmosphere. The stark contrast between the warmth indoors and the cold outside mirrored the internal contrasts George was experiencing, comfort tinged with sadness. One evening, George sat at his desk, working on the manuscript with renewed intensity. The words had been flowing more freely in recent days, each page a testament to the progress he was making. Yet, there was still a lingering uncertainty about whether he could truly capture the essence of his relationship with Emily. As he wrote, George's thoughts wandered to a specific memory, a quiet evening spent together at their favorite park, where they had often found solace from the world. He remembered the way the sunlight had filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over everything. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt perfect, a fleeting sense of peace amidst the challenges they faced. Inspired by this memory, George decided to take a break from writing and visit the park. He hoped that returning to this place would provide a sense of comfort and perhaps even inspire him further. He put on his coat, braving the cold, and made his way to the park. The park, now touched by the early signs of winter, was peaceful and still. The trees were bare, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. The ground was scattered with fallen leaves, their colors faded to brown. Despite the chill, the park held a quiet beauty, a reminder of the natural cycles of change and renewal. George walked along the familiar paths, his breath visible in the cold air. He found a bench and sat quietly, allowing himself to be enveloped by the surroundings. The park, though different from the vibrant place it had been in summer, still offered a sense of tranquility. He closed his eyes and let the memories of the park, of the times he and Emily had spent here, wash over him. As he sat there, George reflected on his writing and the challenges he faced. The manuscript, though progressing, still felt incomplete. He was grappling with how to convey the depth of his emotions and the impact of Emily's presence in his life. The park, with its quiet beauty, seemed to offer a metaphor for his own journey, a landscape touched by loss but still holding the promise of something enduring. The sun began to set, casting a soft, pink hue across the sky. The park was bathed in a gentle twilight, the light fading but not yet gone. George felt a sense of calm wash over him, a fragile hope that perhaps the manuscript would come together in its own time. The evening had provided him with a moment of clarity and peace, a reminder that amidst the grief and uncertainty, there was still beauty to be found. Returning to his apartment, George felt a renewed sense of purpose. The park, the memories, and the quiet reflection had all contributed to a deeper understanding of his task. He resumed his writing with a sense of hope, the words flowing more easily as he channeled the inspiration he had gathered from his visit. The chapter concluded with George's quiet determination to continue his work. The evening at the park had been a poignant reminder of the connection he shared with Emily, a connection that was still alive in his memories and in the pages of his manuscript. As he settled into his evening routine, George felt a renewed sense of resolve. The journey of writing the book was far from over, but with each step, he was moving closer to completing a tribute to the love he had lost and the hope he was beginning to find. Chapter 18. The Winter Solstice. The city was blanketed in a layer of snow, its usual hustle muted under the serene coat of winter. George's apartment, with its large windows, offered a panoramic view of the snow-covered streets below. The world outside seemed to have slowed down, the soft snowfall creating a quiet, reflective atmosphere. One evening, as the winter solstice approached, George sat by the window, watching the snowflakes fall gently to the ground. The room was warm and softly illuminated by the glow of a few strategically placed lamps, their light casting a cozy, golden hue over the space. The contrast between the warmth inside and the cold outside created a comforting cocoon, a temporary escape from the ongoing grief that George had been navigating. The solstice, the shortest day of the year, marked a turning point, a moment of reflection and renewal. George took this opportunity to pause and assess his progress. He had been diligently working on the manuscript, each page a step towards capturing the essence of his relationship with Emily. Yet, as he reviewed his work, he realized that he still struggled with how to convey the depth of their love and the impact of her absence. To find clarity, George decided to take a contemplative walk in the snow. He bundled up in his warmest coat, scarf, and gloves, and stepped out into the crisp winter air. The snow crunched beneath his boots, each step a reminder of the solitude he felt. The city was transformed by the snow, its familiar streets and buildings taking on a magical quality in the soft, white light. George walked through the quiet streets, the falling snow creating a muffled stillness. The world seemed both expansive and intimate, the snowflakes dancing around him as he moved. He found himself drawn to a small, secluded park nearby, its winter landscape stark yet beautiful. The park, with its snow-covered benches and bare trees, held a serene, almost timeless quality. He wandered through the park, pausing to take in the tranquility of the scene. The snow-covered landscape evoked a sense of purity and renewal, a contrast to the emotional turmoil he had been experiencing. George sat on a snow-covered bench, his breath visible in the cold air, and allowed himself to simply be present in the moment. The quiet of the park, the soft falling snow, and the stillness of the night provided a rare sense of peace. As he sat there, George reflected on the manuscript and his journey so far. The solstice, symbolizing the return of longer days and the promise of new beginnings, offered a metaphor for his own path. He realized that while the process of writing and grieving was challenging, it was also a path towards healing and acceptance. The winter solstice marked a pause, a moment to recognize the ongoing struggle, but also to appreciate the progress he had made. Returning to his apartment, George felt a renewed sense of purpose. The walk in the snow and the quiet reflection had provided him with a fresh perspective. The manuscript, though still a work in progress, was a testament to his journey and his love for Emily. As he settled back at his desk, the soft light of the lamp casting a warm glow over the room, he resumed his writing with a sense of calm determination. The chapter ended with George's contemplation of the solstice and its significance. The winter evening had offered him a moment of solace and insight, a reminder that amidst the darkness, there was always the promise of light. As he continued his work, George felt a renewed sense of hope, the solstice marking both an end and a new beginning in his journey of grief and remembrance. Chapter 19. A Glimpse of the Future. The new year brought with it a sense of fresh beginnings, even as George continued to navigate the shadows of his grief. The city, now fully entrenched in winter, was wrapped in a blanket of snow that glistened under the weak winter sun. The air was crisp, carrying a promise of renewal and change. One morning, George sat at his desk, reviewing the manuscript with a critical eye. He had made considerable progress, but there were still parts that felt incomplete, moments where his emotions seemed to elude the page. The book was an evolving reflection of his journey, and he knew it needed more depth to truly capture the essence of his relationship with Emily. To gain new perspective, George decided to visit a local art gallery that was featuring an exhibit on abstract art. He had always found art to be a source of inspiration and clarity, and he hoped that immersing himself in creativity would help him find the right words for his manuscript. At the gallery, George moved through the space with quiet reverence. The exhibit featured a range of abstract pieces, each one a burst of color and form that seemed to convey emotions and stories beyond the surface. The vibrant canvases and intricate sculptures offered a stark contrast to the muted winter outside, their energy a reminder of the potential for transformation and renewal. George found himself drawn to a particular piece, a large, abstract painting that seemed to capture the turbulence and depth of human emotion. The swirling colors and bold strokes resonated with him, evoking a sense of chaos and beauty that mirrored his own inner landscape. He stood before the painting for a long time, letting the imagery wash over him, feeling a renewed sense of connection to his own creative process. As he continued to explore the gallery, George took note of how each piece of art conveyed a unique perspective. The abstract nature of the works allowed for personal interpretation, a reminder that emotions and experiences could be expressed in myriad ways. The gallery visit provided him with a fresh outlook, a reminder that there was no single way to capture his story, only his own truth. Returning home, George felt invigorated and inspired. The experience at the gallery had offered him a new lens through which to view his manuscript. He approached his writing with a renewed sense of freedom, allowing himself to explore different styles and approaches. The abstract art had reminded him that the essence of their story could be conveyed through emotion and imagery, rather than strict adherence to conventional narrative structures. The chapter concluded with George's quiet determination to infuse his manuscript with the inspiration he had gained from the gallery. The new year had brought a sense of possibility and renewal, and George was eager to channel this energy into his writing. As he sat at his desk, the soft light of his lamp casting a warm glow over the pages, he felt a renewed sense of hope. The journey of writing the book was far from over, but with each step, he was moving closer to creating a meaningful tribute to Emily and their shared life. Chapter 20. The Unspoken Promise. The city was in the midst of winter's grasp, with the landscape covered in a heavy, unyielding blanket of snow. The stark beauty of the season seemed to amplify George's sense of isolation, even as he continued to immerse himself in the writing process. The cold air and gray skies created a somber backdrop, mirroring the introspective mood that had settled over him. One afternoon, as George worked on the manuscript, he found himself reflecting on the moments of connection he and Emily had shared. Their relationship had been marked by an unspoken understanding, a deep bond that transcended words. This silent communication, full of nuance and emotion, was something he struggled to capture fully in his writing. Seeking solace and inspiration, George decided to revisit a place that held special significance for him and Emily, the small, serene lake on the outskirts of the city. This lake had been a frequent retreat for them, a place where they could escape the demands of everyday life and simply be together. It was a place where the quiet beauty of nature mirrored the peace they found in each other's presence. George arrived at the lake in the late afternoon, the light of the setting sun casting a soft, golden glow over the snow-covered landscape. The lake was frozen, its surface a smooth, reflective sheet of ice. The surrounding trees, bare and dusted with snow, stood in solemn stillness. The scene was both tranquil and poignant, evoking a deep sense of nostalgia. He walked along the edge of the lake, his footsteps crunching softly in the snow. The stillness of the environment offered a reflective space, a place where he could confront his thoughts and emotions. George paused to sit on a snow-covered bench, allowing himself to absorb the serenity of the setting. As he sat there, George contemplated the nature of the unspoken promise he had made to Emily, to honor her memory and their love through his writing. This promise was not just about completing the manuscript, but about capturing the essence of their relationship in a way that honored their bond. It was about conveying the depth of his love and the impact of her absence, while also finding a way to express the silent understanding that had been such a core part of their connection. The setting sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows and bathing the landscape in a soft, pink light. The tranquility of the lake, combined with the fading light, created a moment of profound stillness. George felt a sense of clarity and resolve, a renewed determination to honor the unspoken promise he had made to Emily. Returning to his apartment, George approached his manuscript with a fresh perspective. The time spent at the lake had provided him with a deeper understanding of the emotional core he wanted to convey. He focused on capturing the essence of their silent communication, the profound connection that had been a defining feature of their relationship. As the day came to an end, George continued his writing with a sense of purpose and commitment. The chapter reflected his determination to honor Emily's memory and their shared love, capturing the unspoken promise that had guided him throughout the writing process. The evening settled in, and George felt a renewed sense of hope, knowing that with each page, he was moving closer to fulfilling the promise he had made and creating a meaningful tribute to the love he had lost. Chapter 21. The Ephemeral Light. The days were growing longer, a subtle hint of spring beginning to pierce through the winter's grasp. The gradual transition from the harsh cold to a more temperate climate brought a sense of hope and renewal, a contrast to the still-present sadness that lingered in George's heart. The apartment, bathed in the soft light of early spring, seemed to hold a promise of change. One afternoon, George found himself reflecting on the passage of time and its effect on his healing process. The manuscript was progressing steadily, but he felt that there was still something missing, a sense of closure and acceptance. The journey of writing about his and Emily's life was both a tribute and a path towards his own emotional resolution. Feeling the need for a fresh perspective, George decided to visit a nearby botanical garden. The garden, known for its early spring blooms, offered a sanctuary of color and life in the midst of the still cold season. He hoped that the vibrant surroundings would provide him with new inspiration and help him find the closure he sought. Arriving at the garden, George was greeted by a landscape coming to life. The once bare branches of the trees were beginning to show the first signs of budding leaves, and early flowers were starting to bloom. The garden, though not yet in full spring splendor, was a testament to nature's resilience and the promise of renewal. George wandered through the pathways, taking in the vibrant colors and fragrant scents that filled the air. The sight of blooming flowers and the sound of birds returning from their winter migration offered a hopeful contrast to the somber winter that had dominated his recent months. He paused to admire a cluster of crocuses, their delicate petals emerging from the earth, symbolizing the resilience of life even in the face of adversity. As he walked, George allowed himself to be fully immersed in the beauty of the garden. The colors, the scents, and the sounds all contributed to a sense of peace and renewal. He reflected on the parallels between the garden's rebirth and his own journey through grief. The gradual emergence of life from the cold, barren winter seemed to mirror his own process of finding hope and acceptance. George found a quiet spot near a small pond, where the water was still and reflective. He sat on a nearby bench, the gentle warmth of the sun on his face, and contemplated the manuscript, The vibrant setting provided him with a renewed sense of clarity. He realized that the missing element in his writing was the acceptance of the cycle of life and the beauty that could be found even in moments of loss. The afternoon wore on, and George felt a renewed sense of purpose. The garden had offered him not only inspiration but also a profound understanding of the healing process. The manuscript, like the garden, needed to reflect the balance between sorrow and hope, between the past and the future. Returning to his apartment, George approached his writing with a fresh perspective. The vibrant images and the sense of renewal he had experienced at the garden were infused into his manuscript. He worked with a renewed sense of determination, aiming to capture the essence of his journey and the beauty of the memories he shared with Emily. The chapter ended with George's quiet reflection on the day's experience. The botanical garden had provided him with a sense of closure and a renewed hope, mirroring the gradual transition he was experiencing in his own life. As he continued his writing, he felt a sense of peace and acceptance, knowing that he was moving closer to completing a meaningful tribute to the love he had shared and the promise of new beginnings. Chapter 22. The Quiet Resolve. As spring advanced, the city began to awaken from its winter slumber. The once barren trees were now adorned with fresh, green leaves, and the air was filled with the sweet fragrance of blooming flowers. The shift in seasons mirrored George's own evolving state of mind as he continued to work diligently on the manuscript. One day, George decided to take a break from his usual routine and visit a quiet, secluded spot in the city, an old library known for its serene atmosphere and historic charm. The library, with its high ceilings and rows of ancient books, offered a calm sanctuary that George hoped would help him gain clarity and focus. Entering the library, George was greeted by the soft hush of pages turning and the faint scent of old books. The tranquility of the space provided a stark contrast to the bustling city outside. He wandered through the aisles, running his fingers along the spines of the books, each one a vessel of knowledge and stories from the past. George found a comfortable spot in a reading nook by a large window that overlooked a small garden. The natural light streaming in created a warm, inviting space. He settled into an armchair and took out his manuscript, opening it to the latest section he had been working on. As he read through the pages, George's thoughts wandered to the essence of his story. The manuscript had evolved into a poignant reflection of his relationship with Emily, yet he felt there was still a need to refine and distill the core of their shared experiences. The library, with its timeless ambience, seemed to offer the perfect environment for this introspective work. The quiet of the library allowed George to immerse himself fully in his writing. He focused on the nuances of emotion, striving to capture the delicate balance between joy and sorrow, love and loss. Each word and phrase was carefully considered, as he aimed to create a narrative that truly honored the depth of his feelings and the significance of Emily's presence in his life. Time passed unnoticed as George worked. The soft rustling of pages and the distant murmur of other library patrons created a soothing background. The setting provided him with a sense of calm and a renewed resolve to complete the manuscript with the depth and sensitivity it deserved. As the afternoon drew to a close, George packed up his materials and left the library, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The time spent in the tranquil environment had provided him with the focus he needed to refine his writing. He returned to his apartment with a clear vision of how to approach the final sections of his manuscript. The chapter concluded with George's quiet determination to bring his project to completion. The peaceful hours spent in the library had reinforced his commitment to capturing the essence of his journey with Emily. As he resumed his writing, George felt a profound sense of resolve, knowing that he was nearing the end of his journey and preparing to honor the memory of his beloved Emily with the depth and respect it deserved. Chapter 23. The Embrace of Memory. The days grew warmer as spring unfolded its full splendor. The city, once gray and somber, was now vibrant with color and life. George's apartment, bathed in the soft glow of early evening light, seemed to reflect the season's renewal. Yet, the warmth and brightness outside contrasted with the quiet introspection that filled George's heart. One afternoon, George decided to revisit an old photo album that he and Emily had once enjoyed together. The album, a collection of cherished memories, had been tucked away for some time. He hoped that revisiting these images would offer him further insight and inspiration as he neared the completion of his manuscript. Sitting at his desk, George opened the album and began to leaf through its pages. Each photograph captured a moment from their life together. Smiles, shared experiences, and the quiet, everyday joys that defined their relationship. The images evoked a deep sense of nostalgia and warmth, reminding George of the love and happiness they had shared. As he looked at the photographs, George found himself reflecting on the depth of their connection. The images told a story of a relationship built on understanding, trust, and unspoken affection. They captured the essence of what he had been striving to convey in his writing, a love that was profound and enduring, even in the face of life's challenges. The more he looked at the photos, the more George felt a sense of peace and acceptance. The memories, though tinged with sadness, were also a source of comfort. They reminded him that the love he and Emily had shared was real and significant, and that their story was worth telling with honesty and grace. Inspired by the photos, George returned to his manuscript with a renewed sense of clarity. He incorporated the emotions and memories evoked by the album into his writing, focusing on the subtle yet profound aspects of their relationship. The manuscript began to take on a new depth, reflecting not only the challenges they faced, but also the beauty and strength of their bond. As the evening light faded, George closed the photo album and set it aside. The images had offered him a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of his own journey. The manuscript, now infused with the essence of their shared memories, was nearing completion. The chapter concluded with George's quiet reflection on the significance of the memories he had revisited. The photo album had provided him with a meaningful connection to the past and a clearer vision for his writing. As he continued to work on the manuscript, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the love he had shared with Emily and a renewed commitment to honoring that love through his words. Chapter 24, The Final Revision. As spring deepened, the city was alive with the vibrant colors and sounds of the season. Flowers were in full bloom, and the trees were lush with new leaves. The warmth of the sun and the gentle breeze brought a sense of renewal and hope. In contrast, George's apartment, though bright with natural light, was filled with the quiet focus of a writer approaching the end of a significant journey. George sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of handwritten pages and notes. The manuscript, now nearing completion, was spread out before him. He had spent countless hours revising and refining, striving to ensure that each word captured the essence of his and Emily's story. The final revision was both a culmination of his efforts and a moment of profound introspection. He began by carefully reading through the manuscript, noting areas that required refinement. Each chapter had been meticulously crafted, but he knew that the final touches were crucial to creating a cohesive and impactful narrative. George approached the task with a sense of reverence, understanding that this was his last opportunity to perfect the tribute to Emily's memory. With each pass through the manuscript, George made subtle adjustments, rewording sentences, clarifying descriptions, and ensuring that the emotional flow was consistent throughout. He focused on enhancing the narrative's depth, paying close attention to the parts where he wanted to convey the most profound aspects of their relationship. As he worked, George reflected on the journey of writing the manuscript. The process had been both challenging and cathartic, offering him a way to channel his grief into something meaningful. The final revision was a chance to honor the love he and Emily had shared, and to create a lasting tribute that captured the essence of their story. The days passed in a blur of focused effort and quiet contemplation. The manuscript gradually transformed into a polished work, each page a testament to the depth of George's emotions and the significance of his experiences with Emily. The final revisions were a labor of love, driven by a desire to honor her memory with the utmost care and respect. As the manuscript neared its final form, George felt a mix of accomplishment and bittersweet reflection. The process of writing and revising had been a journey of healing, and he was both grateful for the opportunity to tell their story and saddened by the reminder of her absence. The chapter ended with George's quiet satisfaction as he completed the final revision. The manuscript, now a reflection of their shared life and love, was ready to be shared with the world. The completion of this project marked a significant milestone in his journey of grief and remembrance, offering him a sense of closure and the fulfillment of the promise he had made to Emily. Chapter 25. The Echoes of Love. As summer took hold, the city was alive with vibrant hues and the warmth of the season. The streets buzzed with energy, and the air was filled with the heady fragrance of blooming flowers. In stark contrast, George's apartment, though filled with sunlight, exuded a quiet, contemplative atmosphere. The completion of the manuscript marked the end of a long and arduous journey, yet it also signified the beginning of a new chapter in his life. George had devoted countless hours to perfecting his manuscript, each page a testament to his love for Emily and the profound impact her illness had on their relationship. The final draft was meticulously reviewed, refined, and polished. He had poured his heart into every word, striving to honor Emily's memory and capture the essence of their time together. With each revision, he felt a mixture of sadness and pride, knowing that he was creating something that would preserve their story for others to understand. The final steps of the manuscript's preparation involved more than just a review of the text. George carefully designed the cover, choosing a photograph of Emily that captured her spirit and grace. The image was a silent testament to her strength and beauty, a fitting representation of the woman he had loved so deeply. He wrote a heartfelt dedication, a simple yet profound tribute to the love that had shaped his life. This dedication was a final gesture of his affection, a way to acknowledge the depth of his feelings and the significance of their shared experiences. As the manuscript neared submission, George found himself reflecting on the places and moments that had defined their relationship. He revisited the small cafe where they had spent countless afternoons, their conversations and laughter creating a tapestry of memories. He walked through the park where they had strolled hand in hand, the same path that had witnessed their quiet moments of connection. Each place held a special significance, a reminder of the love that had been both his solace and his inspiration. The days leading up to the manuscript's submission were filled with a quiet determination. George worked tirelessly to ensure that every detail was perfect, from the formatting to the final proofread. Each adjustment, each correction, was made with the utmost care, driven by a desire to create a work that truly honored Emily's memory. The process was both cathartic and challenging, a final act of love and dedication. As summer's warmth enveloped the city, George took time to enjoy the season's simple pleasures. He spent lazy afternoons in the sun, finding moments of peace amidst the busyness of life. The gentle breeze and the golden light provided a sense of calm and renewal, a contrast to the emotional intensity of his writing. These moments of respite offered him a chance to reflect on his journey and the progress he had made in coming to terms with his grief. On the day of the manuscript's submission, George felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The completed work was sent off, and he took a moment to acknowledge the significance of this milestone. The manuscript, now ready to be shared with the world, represented the culmination of his efforts and a tribute to the love he had shared with Emily. It was a testament to their journey, a reflection of the profound impact she had on his life. As the manuscript was being processed, George continued to navigate the complexities of his emotions. The summer days provided him with opportunities for reflection and growth. He spent time with friends and family, allowing their support and companionship to help him through the challenging moments. The process of healing was gradual, but George felt a sense of progress as he embraced the support of those around him. The chapter concluded with George's quiet acceptance of the manuscript's completion and the beginning of a new phase in his life. The love he and Emily had shared was now immortalized in the pages of the manuscript, a legacy that would endure beyond their time together. As he looked out over the city, bathed in the golden light of summer, George felt a deep sense of gratitude and peace. The journey of writing had been both a tribute to his love and a path towards personal healing. With the manuscript now complete and on its way to being published, George embraced the promise of new beginnings and the hope for a future where the echoes of his love for Emily would continue to resonate.